From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Han intentado asesinarme el día de hoy.
There has been an attempt to assassinate me. I have no doubt that this all points to the extreme right in Venezuela in alliance with the right in Colombia.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has survived an apparent assassination attempt by drones packed with explosives. We'll get response from, among others, Alejandro Velasco, born and raised in Caracas, now executive editor of NACLA Report on the Americas. But first, 17-year-old Ahed Tamimi has been described as the Rosa Parks of Palestine. After 8 months, she's been released from an Israeli jail.
I hope for the liberation of Palestine, for the end of the occupation, for us to be able to go anywhere we want, anytime we want, without anyone preventing us from doing so.
Ahed Tamimi became a hero to Palestinians last year when a video went viral showing her slapping an Israeli soldier after she learned her cousin had been shot in the head by a soldier with a rubber-coated steel bullet.
My goal wasn't to hit him. I didn't intend to hit him. He had shot my cousin in the head, and my cousin was going to die because of the injury. The soldier at the front of my house was shooting at children and young men in the street. I'm not the one that went to him. He's the one that was at the front of my door.
We'll speak with Ahed Tamimi from her home in the West Bank. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro has survived an apparent assassination attempt. Officials say drones loaded with explosives detonated above Maduro as he gave a nationally televised speech at a military event in Caracas on Saturday. Maduro has blamed the outgoing Colombian president for the attack.
Han intentado asesinarme el día de hoy.
There has been an attempt to assassinate me. I have no doubt that this all points to the extreme right in Venezuela in alliance with the right in Colombia, and that Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos is behind this attempt. I have no doubt. Preliminary investigations have indicated to us that there are various financial backers of this attempt on my life. They live in the United States and the state of Florida. Hopefully, President Donald Trump's government is willing to fight these terrorist groups which are attempting great attacks against countries on this continent, in this case, Venezuela.
U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has denied U.S. involvement in the attack while speaking on Fox News Sunday.
Well, I can say unequivocally there was no U.S. government involvement in this at all.
We'll have more on Venezuela later in the broadcast. President Trump has admitted the purpose of a June 2016 meeting in Trump Tower between a Kremlin-connected lawyer and Trump's son, Don Trump Jr., among others, was to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. On Sunday, Trump tweeted, "Fake news reporting, a complete fabrication, that I am concerned about the meeting my wonderful son Donald had in Trump Tower. This was a meeting to get information on an opponent, totally legal and done all the time in politics, and it went nowhere. I did not know about it," he tweeted. Trump's tweet reveals he lied last year when he personally dictated a statement released by his son Donald Trump Jr., which claimed the meeting was mostly about U.S. adoption of Russian children. In Northern California, the Mendocino complex fire is now the fourth largest fire in California history, with more than 250,000 acres burning. The raging wildfire has destroyed 68 homes and forced evacuations in 3 Northern California counties. Meanwhile, the death toll from California's Carr fire rose to 7 over the weekend as climate change-fueled wildfires continue to blaze across California. The victim was a 21-year-old Pacific Gas and Electric worker who was working to restore power lines damaged in the fire. In Indonesia, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake has killed at least 91 people on the island of Lombok, with the death toll expected to rise. More than 200 people have been injured in Sunday's earthquake, which destroyed thousands of homes and buildings and forced more than 10,000 residents and tourists to evacuate the island. In Zimbabwe, a military crackdown against opposition activists continued over the weekend following last week's historic presidential elections. Longtime leader Robert Mugabe's former vice president, then acting president Emerson Mnangagwa, was declared the winner of Monday's election, although opposition parties have rejected the outcome, questioning the vote count. Human rights groups now say dozens of opposition activists have been abducted, attacked, or raped by unidentified men during a wave of post-election repression. The army has also been deployed to the streets of the capital, Harare. In South Sudan, President Salva Kiir and the rebel leader Riek Machar have reached a peace deal aimed at ending South Sudan's 5-year civil war, which has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced millions, and pushed South Sudan to the brink of famine. The conflict began in 2013 after President Kiir fired Machar, then serving as vice president. Under the new power-sharing agreement, Machar will return to power as one of 5 vice presidents. In Gaza, Israeli soldiers killed 2 Palestinian protesters Friday during the latest round of protests at the separation fence between Israel and Gaza. One of the victims was 15-year-old Muad al-Suri, who was shot in the stomach by an Israeli soldier. Gaza authorities say the Israeli military has killed at least 160 Palestinians and wounded over 15,000 more since the nonviolent Great March of Return protests began March 30th. Israel and Egypt are discussing a deal aimed at improving living conditions in Gaza. Meanwhile, in Israel, tens of thousands protested against the controversial new law defining Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. The protest was led by the Druze community, an ethnic and religious minority in Israel. President Trump has continued his racist attacks against prominent black journalists, athletes, and politicians. Early Saturday morning, he insulted NBA superstar LeBron James and CNN host Don Lemon, tweeting, quote, "LeBron James was just interviewed by the dumbest man on television, Don Lemon. He made LeBron look smart, which isn't easy to do," unquote. He said this just before leaving for Ohio. Trump also insulted California Democratic Congressmember Maxine Waters during a campaign rally in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, late last week, falsely claiming Waters has a very low IQ. In response to Trump's comments about LeBron James, Melania Trump said through her spokesperson, quote, "It looks like LeBron James is working to do good things on behalf of our next generation." Legendary NFL wide receiver Randy Moss paid tribute to African-American men and women killed by police during the NFL Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Canton, Ohio, Saturday night. He wore a tie stitched with the names Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Akai Gurley, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Alton Sterling, Trayvon Martin, and other victims of police brutality or white vigilante violence. This is NFL star Randy Moss speaking in an interview after the NFL ceremony.
What I wanted to be able to express with my ties to let these families know that they're not alone. You know, I'm not here, voicing, but by these names on my tie at a big platform as the Pro Football Hall of Fame, there's a lot of stuff going on in our country, and I just want to let these family members know that they're not alone.
In Portland, Oregon, anti-racist, anti-fascist protesters faced off against members of the far right-wing group Patriot Prayer during a protest and counter-protest Saturday. Hours into the competing protests, police officers attacked the anti-fascist counter-protesters with pepper spray and stun grenades. Oregon's police chief has ordered a review of the use of force at Saturday's protest. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the Metro Rail system's largest union announced its workers would not participate in a proposed plan to run separate trains for white supremacists planning to attend the far-right-wing Unite the Right rally in D.C. on August 12th. After the rail workers' union leaked the proposal and vowed not to participate, the transit agency said it was no longer considering the plan to run special trains to accommodate the white supremacist protesters on the anniversary of the University of Virginia Charlottesville white supremacist protests. And today marks the 73rd anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, which killed 140,000 people and seriously injured another 100,000. This is the mayor of Hiroshima, Kazumi Matsui, speaking at a commemoration ceremony earlier today in Japan.
With the current rise of self-centered nationalism and the modernization of nuclear weapons, we are seeing a return to attention amongst nations that has not been seen since the Cold War. I hope the Japanese government will play its role in realizing the pacifism that the Constitution manifests and leads the international community in enhancing dialogue and cooperation for a nuclear-free world.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with a young woman described as the Rosa Parks of Palestine, 17-year-old Ahed Tamimi. Last year, Ahed became a hero to Palestinians after a video went viral showing her slapping a heavily armed Israeli soldier near her family's home in the occupied West Bank. The incident came just after Ahed learned her cousin had been gravely wounded by the Israeli soldier who shot him in the head using a rubber-coated steel bullet. Video of Ahed confronting the soldier went viral, elevating her into a symbol of Palestinian resistance. Ahed Tamimi was soon arrested in the middle of the night, charged with assault on an Israeli military court. She was sentenced to 8 months in an Israeli prison. She turned 17 there. She celebrated her 17th birthday behind bars. Her mother was also arrested and charged for incitement, in part for streaming video online showing the interaction between Ahed and the Israeli soldier. Both Ahed and her mother, Nariman, were released in late July. Last week, soon after she was released, Democracy Now's Nermeen Sheikh and I spoke with Ahed Tamimi from her home in the West Bank village of Nandvi Salah. Ahed, welcome to Democracy Now! How does it feel to be free from jail?
It's an extremely wonderful feeling. I hope all prisoners, men and women, live to experience this joy. Of course, my joy is incomplete because my brothers and sisters remain in prison, and I hope that they are liberated and feel the happiness that I feel today.
Can you talk about the day you were released? Can you talk about that Sunday where the Israeli military took you and your mother?
I was released from prison at 5:30, and they took me to Antis, but they told my parents that I would be released at the Jbara checkpoint. It's about an hour between Antis and Jbara. They kept playing with my parents, telling them here, then there, then there. They made my parents go everywhere. At the end, they ended up dropping us off at the gateway to the village.
Can you explain, Ahed, what actually led to your arrest?
They accused me of hitting a soldier. I had 12 charges brought up against me, but the main one was the charge of hitting a soldier in front of the door of my house. My goal wasn't to hit him. I didn't intend to hit him. He had shot my cousin in the head, and my cousin was going to die because of the injury. The soldier at the front of my house was shooting at children and young men in the street. I'm not the one that went to him. He's the one that was at the front of my door.
Can you talk about Mohammed, your, 15-year-old cousin, and explain what the Israeli soldier did to him? What does it mean to be shot at close range by a rubber-coated steel bullet?
He was on a hill, and Israeli soldiers came up and shot him, and the bullet went through his head. It went through here and was lodged here. It was a lethal injury, and there was a chance he would die. His surgery took a very long time. It took a long time for him to begin to walk again and to stand up straight and everything.
Can you tell us, Ahed, what happened after you were arrested? Where were you taken?
They took me to an interrogation center, and then from there, they took me to prison.
You've said that there were several violations during your interrogation. What were those violations?
The interrogation was inappropriate because there was verbal harassment. The interrogator would tell me, "Your hair is pretty, your eyes are pretty." There were no female soldiers with me. My parents weren't allowed to be with me, nor my lawyer. They threatened me with my family by saying, "If you don't confess, we're going to detain your entire family."
What kind of other questions did they ask you in that interrogation? And were there women present, family, your lawyer?
No, there was no one with me. They asked me why I hit the soldier. There were a lot of questions the interrogator asked me during the interrogation.
What did you tell them when they asked you why you slapped the Israeli soldier?
The entire time during the interrogation, I used my right to remain silent and did not confess anything.
How long did that interrogation, that one-sided interrogation, take?
There were several interrogations. There were actually 4 separate interrogations. Each one was different. One was 4 hours, another 5 or 6.
And you were always alone? Never with a lawyer or family?
Never. It was always just me alone with the interrogators.
With the male interrogators?
Yes, they were male interrogators.
Can you talk then about your trial?
They used to take me to court periodically, and they kept discussing the case and interrogating me until I was sentenced to 8 months.
And Ahed, what were the conditions like in the jail where you were held? Were there other children there?
The prison was very, very difficult. There were 29 other female prisoners with me. The numbers would go up and down depending on the situation. The conditions for female prisoners and male prisoners is difficult. The rooms are very, very small. There are no air vents. There was medical neglect and prevention of education. They attempted to prevent us from getting educated, but prisoners are always strong, persistent, and steadfast.
And who were the 29 other prisoners, and you said that the composition of the prisoners changed. Were they all women? Were they children?
There were women and there were children. There was one woman who had been detained under administrative detention. Administrative detention means the detention is based on undisclosed files, so the detainee doesn't know why they're detained. Administrative detainees only attend administrative courts, and their sentence is always extended. At first, it might be 6 months, but it'll be renewed another time for 4 months. They'll tell you your administrative detention is 6 months, but then after 6 months, they'll tell you they've extended another 4. After 4 months, they'll tell you another 6. It's like the prisoner, may God rest his soul, Ali Jamal, who spent 7 consecutive years under administrative detention. There are over 350 children in prison, and 3 children who are under administrative detention. The conditions children endure in prison are very difficult. Prison isn't for anyone, and the prison administration puts a lot of pressure on them, so it's very difficult. I hope for the release of all prisoners, and especially children, as soon as possible.
Now, Ahed, following a criticism, widespread criticism, Israel instituted a separate military court for minors, for children, in 2009. What, if anything, has changed since then?
Nothing's changed. There are children who are in Israeli detention for over 10 years, children sentenced to 13 years, children sentenced to 14 years. The court just changed its name to a children's court. The judge is still a Zionist judge. The court is still a Zionist court. It's still a racist court, so nothing has really changed.
In your village, Nabi Sahleh, if you could talk specifically about the situation with Israeli settlements in the area. Children in Nabi Sahleh are reportedly taught how to deal with Israeli soldiers if they come to detain them.
طبعا في بقرية النبي صالح مستوطنة حلميش.
In Nabi Saleh, there is a settlement, the settlement of Halmish, which has taken over the Nabi Saleh water spring. It rarely gives the village of Nabi Saleh adequate water.
كافية. كمان قرية النبي صالح كثير يعني فيها يعني احتكاك دائما بيكون.
Almost everyone in Nabi Saleh has been detained or shot at or harassed by Israeli soldiers. We have more than one martyr. In the last decade or so, there's been a lot of resistance within Nabi Saleh, and we lost 4 martyrs.
السنين أو فترة المقاومة الشعبية لقرية النبي صالح خسرنا 4 شهداء اللي هم رشدي التميمي، مصطفى التميمي.
And they are Rushdi Tamimi, Mustafa Tamimi, Izzuddin Tamimi. And there was a young man who died in Nabi Saleh, whose name is Saba Nidal Ubaid.
اللي اسمه سبا نضال عبيد و يعني قرية نبي صالح كتير.
Nabi Saleh is a point of a lot of resistance. We always say our problem isn't with the settlement, it's with the entire occupation. We can deal with the settlement, but we want the occupation to end.
بس احنا بدنا الاحتلال كله يزيل.
Ahed Tamimi, when you were in jail, another one of your relatives, 20-year-old Izzuddin Tamimi, was killed in June after being shot in the back by an Israeli soldier. The Israeli human rights group B'Tselem said his killing was illegal and unjustified. Can you talk about what happened and what you understood when you were in prison?
طبعا كان استشهاد عز الدين التميمي بفترة.
The martyrdom of Izzuddin Tamimi while I was in prison was something very difficult for me. It was very, very difficult. I don't know how to describe the feeling. To lose someone from your family while you're in prison and you don't know what's happened, it was a lot of anxiety. It's a difficult thing.
Can you tell us who Izzuddin was?
Izzuddin يعني مالوش يعني بشي مالوش بحاجة.
Izzuddin is a very calm, good person. I think he was in the street. I wasn't there, but they told me he was in the street.
بتوقع إنه كان على الشارع لأن أنا ما كنتش بالقصة كلها. حكولي إنه كان على الشارع.
He was being pursued after being detained a year ago. So they came to detain him and he ran away. So they shot him in his neck. They let him bleed on the ground until he lost all his blood and died.
ينزف على الأرض تخسر كل دمه واستشهد.
During the time that you were in prison, during this last 8 months, there was a major uprising in Gaza, the nonviolent Great March of Return that started March 30th. The Israeli military killed, at this point, I believe it's more than 140 Palestinians, injuring something like 14,000 people there. Can you talk about what your knowledge of what's happening in Gaza is and what it meant to you in jail and to Palestinians on the West Bank?
مسيرات العودة انطلقت من وقت تاريخ النكبة. كانت
The Great Return marches were launched from the time of the Nakba and continue until today. And the reality is that the people of Gaza are still continuing these marches. We hope that everyone, even here in the West Bank and those outside, be part of the return marches, just like the ones in Gaza. It's not just Gaza that has refugees, but there are Palestinian refugees everywhere, and they should return to their land, to their country.
Ahed, I want to turn to a video of you in December 2012 when you confronted an Israeli soldier demanding to know what happened to your brother who'd just been arrested. I believe you were only 11 years old at the time.
My brother was 15 years old, and so I went and I asked them. I demanded to know, where did you take my brother? He's 15 years old. What can he do to you? But they didn't respond to me. I got angry and frustrated and began to yell at them.
Well, and 3 years later, a video went viral that showed you biting an Israeli soldier who was holding your brother
on the ground.
This is when they were going to detain my brother, who was 12 years old. He was trying to detain him, so I tried to take my brother back from the hands of the soldier.
Well, many people, Ahad, have remarked on your courage in undertaking such protest at such a young age. Where do you get such bravery from?
All Palestinians have courage. It's different from one person to another. But I grew up in a family where I got used to seeing prisoners, the injured, and martyrs. It reached a level where we were just saying enough with the occupation. So I decided to break the barrier of fear so I can continue defending my land.
I want to read from an article in The Guardian. It said, quote, Ahad is a member of the second generation of Palestinians to grow up under occupation. Her father, Bassem, was born in 1967, the year Israel seized the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War. He and his children have known only a life of checkpoints, identity papers, detentions, house demolitions, intimidation, humiliation, and violence. This is their normality, The Guardian writes. Can you speak in your own words about what life is like growing up under occupation?
Imagine going to your school and finding a checkpoint, so you're prevented from going to school because of this checkpoint, or from going to your university or work. Or imagine that every day the military enters your town and keeps firing gas and bullets, and you're constantly afraid that someone will be killed, or that they'll detain someone. There's a constant fear that you'll lose someone in your family. The occupation is extremely difficult. To look at the settler who is on your land while you're barred from it, it's really so difficult.
Ahad, you've been hailed as the icon of Palestine following this latest protest of yours. Your response to that and where you see yourself in the struggle for Palestine?
I'm very proud that I can be a symbol of the Palestinian cause. I hope that I can live up to this title and that I'm able to spread the message of the Palestinian people and the men and women in prison to the whole world.
What would you like to see happen?
I hope for the liberation of Palestine, for the end of the occupation, for us to be able to go anywhere we want, anytime we want, without anyone preventing us from doing so.
The classes you took, you finished high school in an Israeli prison. What are the classes you took? Who taught you? What kind of discussions did you have behind the bars?
We were taught by the prisoner Khalida Jarrar, and we would learn mathematics, Arabic, English, history, geography, science. We used to take international law classes as well. We took a lot of these different classes.
And did you discuss your own imprisonment as a child and discuss the issues of international law and occupation?
Khalida Jarrar used to teach us about the international law and about all the different conventions within it. We would go through all the violations that happened to us. I didn't have a female soldier with me during my interrogation, but according to the convention, there was supposed to be a female soldier with me during the interrogation. So we would always tie these things together.
And Ahad, you plan to become a lawyer. Explain why you want to study the law.
So that I can use the law to defend the Palestinian cause for liberation.
Ahad, your brother is a student at Birzeit University nearby your village in the West Bank. Do you plan to go to a Palestinian university, or will you go to college outside?
I haven't yet decided where I want to study. I haven't decided and I'm still not sure.
Is your brother at the university now or in prison?
My brother is currently in prison. He was detained while I was in prison.
Would you consider studying in the United States?
I'm still not sure. I still haven't thought about it at all. I've just got out of prison. I just haven't had time to really sit and think about what I want exactly.
And Ahed, what is your message to the United States? What would you like people in the U.S. to know?
I thank everyone who supported me and stood with me in the United States. I urge all the people, all the populations everywhere to put pressure on their governments to support the Palestinian cause.
You have made a distinction, Ahed, between Jews and Zionism. Can you explain the difference?
There's a huge difference between Judaism and Zionism. Judaism is a religion. You know, it's just like Islam. It's just like Christianity. But Zionism, that's the occupation. That's the killing. That's what closes checkpoints. That's what detains innocent people. That's all Zionism that's causing this conflict with Palestinians.
And what did it mean to you when you were in jail, the international solidarity, both on the West Bank and Gaza, within Israel, and around the world?
It was something that kept my spirits up, of course. I hope that strong solidarity continues to extend to all the rest of the prisoners, men and women who remain in prison.
Your mother was in prison for as long as you were, nearly. And she was released with you. Did you see her in prison? And can you explain why she was imprisoned?
I used to see her from 10:30 in the morning to 1 o'clock, and from 2:30 to 5. We were not in the same room, of course, but we were in the same section.
And why she was in jail?
She was detained because... I'm not sure. They accused her of... I'm not sure. Because she came to me during the interrogation. It's unclear to me why they detained my mom.
I know you have to go, Ahed. Do you plan to continue your activism?
Of course, I will continue down this path that I've started, and I will never give up until the day Palestine is liberated.
17-year-old Ahed Tamimi speaking to us from her home in Nabi Saleh in the occupied West Bank. She was released last week from an Israeli prison after serving an 8-month term. The 17-year-old activist became a hero to Palestinians and many others around the world after a video went viral showing her slapping an Israeli soldier near her family's home just after Ahed learned her cousin had been gravely wounded by an Israeli soldier who shot him in the head using a rubber-coated steel bullet. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, the first attempted assassination by drone strike. It occurred in Venezuela against the president, Nicolas Maduro, this weekend. Stay with us.
السلام كلهم حكي فاضي لما ما في عمل بعد الكلام وعد ورا وعد الشعب تعب بالفعل شبعانة من لغة السلام صارت لغة فاشلة صرت أسمع نفس الجمل ورا جمل زهقت مليت من نفس الفيلم دوبالكم من الوجوه المألوفة من البسمات المرسومة من النصوص المحفوظة انتبهوا كيف اللغة محدودة يمكن يسموك إرهابي ولكن بكرة يمكن يعتبروك شريكة ورجل دولة حسب مزاجن صار السلام جدنا مش عم بيفيدنا حالتنا حال ما حتى عم بيسمعنا صار السلام جدنا مش عم بيفيدنا حالتنا حال ما حتى عم بيسمعنا
Language of Peace by Lethal Skills and Shadi Mansour. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro has survived an apparent assassination attempt Saturday. Officials say 2 drones loaded with explosives detonated above Maduro as he gave a nationally televised speech at a military event in Caracas. It was the first known attempted assassination by drone against a sitting head of state. Venezuelan television showed Maduro looking up at the sky after hearing the sound of an explosion during his address. After the sound of another explosion, security rushed to surround the president while hundreds of other soldiers ran for cover. 7 people were injured. Officials say neither drone reached its intended target area before detonating. 2 videos posted on Twitter show drones at the scene. One shows a drone crashing into a building. The other shows a drone exploding in midair. In a televised speech, hours after his address was cut short by the assassination attempt, Maduro blamed Colombia for the attack.
There has been an attempt to assassinate me. I have no doubt that this all points to the extreme right in Venezuela in alliance with the right in Colombia, and that Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos is behind this attempt. I have no doubt. Preliminary investigations have indicated to us that there are various financial backers of this attempt on my life. They live in the United States and the state of Florida. Hopefully, President Donald Trump's government is willing to fight these terrorist groups, which are attempting great attacks against countries on this continent, in this case, Venezuela.
Meanwhile, on Sunday, the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, tweeted, within the last 12 months, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence made 3 trips to Latin America to meet at least 8 presidents from whom he demanded support for a military intervention against our brother president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Those are the empire's coup attempts, the Bolivian president Evo Morales tweeted. Speaking on Fox News Sunday, National Security Advisor John Bolton denied the U.S. was behind the apparent drone strike assassination attempt in Caracas.
Well, I can say unequivocally there was no U.S. government involvement in this at all. Now, with respect to what happened last afternoon, look, it could be a lot of things, from a pretext set up by the Maduro regime itself to something else.
A group of Venezuelan soldiers calling itself Operation Phoenix has claimed responsibility for the explosions in a communique posted on Twitter. The group's former leader, Oscar Perez, was killed in a shootout with the government in January after he hijacked a helicopter last year and fired at government buildings. Venezuelan authorities say they've arrested 6 people over Saturday's incident. Maduro replaced longtime President Hugo Chavez after Chavez died of cancer in 2013. He was elected to a new 6-year term in May. Well, for more, we're joined by 3 guests. Via Democracy Now! Video stream, Alejandro Velasco is with us, associate professor at New York University, where he's a historian of modern Latin America. He is the executive editor of NACLA Report on the Americas and the author of the book Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics in the Making of Modern Venezuela. He was born and raised in Caracas. Also with us here in studio, Gabriel Hetland, assistant professor of Latin American Studies at the State University of New York in Albany. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, president of Just Foreign Policy. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Alejandro Velasco. Can you talk about what happened this weekend in Caracas? First time an assassination attempt has been made against a head of state using drones.
Yeah, it was a very confusing situation. Maduro and most of the high command, military high command, as well as officers of the United Socialist Party that he presides over, were gathered to celebrate the 81st anniversary of the National Guard, which has become very prominent in the security apparatus in Venezuela. And as he was laying out some of the reforms that he just recently announced to try to right the ship of Venezuela's economy, what the video showed was, or what you heard from the video was a very loud explosion, and his wife, First Lady Celia Flores, reacting quite surprised, and another general behind him seemingly fainting, and then followed a few seconds after that by another very loud explosion. And then cameras turned to the assembled soldiers below, who began to scatter. And at that point, the feed closed. So from then, what we heard was that there were two separate drones filled with C4 explosives that detonated near a. You also have to understand, this is right in the downtown, very densely packed area of Caracas. Detonated outside of an apartment building. And since then, even though there had been initial reports that perhaps it had been instead a gas explosion in one of the apartments, subsequent reports have disproven that theory. And it's quite clear now that there were actually C4-equipped drones that exploded.
I wanted to turn right now to April, when Vice President Mike Pence, speaking at a Latin American summit in Lima, Peru, said more must be done to isolate Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
We must all stand with our brothers and sisters suffering in Venezuela. And I can promise you the United States will not rest. We will not relent until democracy is restored in Venezuela and the Venezuelan people reclaim their birthright of libertad.
In June, the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, called Pence a viper and vowed to defeat what he called Washington's attempts to force him from power.
Every time the poisonous viper of Mike Pence opens his mouth, I feel stronger, clearer of what the road is. The road is ours. It is Venezuelan. It is not the one Mike Pence points out to us. Not 20 poisonous snakes. Not 20 vipers like Mike Pence.
I wanted to bring Mark Weisbrot into the conversation, head of Just Foreign Policy with the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Can you talk about, well, what Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, tweeted about, saying Pence has made several visits to Latin America, pushing for, he said, military intervention in Venezuela. And if you think there's any relationship between that and what happened this weekend, the first assassination attempt by drone against a head of state anywhere in the world.
Yes, well, I don't have any evidence that the U.S. was behind the attack. It is kind of unusual. The State Department was asked to comment, and they said they had no comment on the attack, which normally, given what the United States has done in Venezuela for the past 20 years, they would at least, you would expect them to say we're against any kind of assassination or any kind of violence like that. And they didn't say that. But, I mean, they've been trying to get rid of the Chavistas for 20 years now. And the difference between the Trump administration and the two previous administrations is that they're more explicit. As you noted, they've called for a military coup in Venezuela, which is something I don't think they've done for 50 years. They didn't even do that in Chile in 73 before the coup happened. They tried to, in the last presidential election in Venezuela, they threatened the opposition candidate who ran in the election, Henry Falcón. They threatened him for running in the election. They threatened him with individual financial sanctions against him if he ran in that race because they didn't want an election. So they're very committed to a regime change strategy, and it's explicit and it's open. That's the real difference between, what they did in the past, like the 2002 coup, for example, which the Bush administration was involved in, but they denied that. And now it's very open and explicit. And the media here kind of ignores it. They treat the United States as primarily a bystander and occasionally report when, something comes out like Trump asked his advisors if they could have a military intervention. That was reported in the press, and then they just go on as though the United States has nothing to do with any of this. So that's something I think that's really important, that you're not getting in the news at all. And then you have you know, the whole narrative that this has something to do with human rights. So when Marco Rubio, who's basically in charge of policy here for the Trump administration, and his Florida crony, who's the U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, and he's, you know, he goes around to countries there and threatens them and tells them to vote with the U.S. And all of this is treated as though they're trying to promote human rights in Venezuela. And again, the media accepts this narrative. And then you look at the U.S. allies in Latin America. You look at Mexico, where over 100 journalists have been killed. And in most of those cases, there's government involvement implicated. And you don't have a single case in Venezuela in the last 20 years of a journalist killed where the government is implicated. And you look at Guatemala, where you know, you talk to a human rights defender there, and they don't expect to be alive a year from now. Again, you don't have anything near that violent in Venezuela. In Colombia, human rights defenders and activists are being killed every week, as you've reported on this show. And again, it's nowhere near. So that's not defending the Venezuelan government. That's just saying that anyone who states publicly that this intervention by the United States, which is constant, which includes the financial embargo that's explicitly intended to prevent the economy from recovering, anybody who says that this has something to do with human rights has to be dishonest.
I want to go back to National Security Advisor John Bolton speaking on Fox News Sunday, denying the U.S. was behind the drone blast in Venezuela on Saturday.
These are things he's said before, and you have to take them for what they're worth. If the government of Venezuela has hard information that they want to present to us that would show a potential violation of U.S. criminal law, we'll take a serious look at it. But in the meantime, I think what we really should focus on is the corruption and the oppression of the Maduro regime in Venezuela.
Alejandro Velasco, can you respond to what he said? Not only talk about the U.S., but also President Maduro talking about the outgoing president of Colombia being behind this, Santos, who will leave office tomorrow. Tomorrow is Inauguration Day in Colombia.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, Colombia, even as the rest of Latin America over the last 20 years are in the so-called left turn or pink tide, most countries in Latin America were electing left-wing governments. Colombia sort of bucked that trend. And so first with the presidency of Álvaro Uribe, who was Santos's mentor, and then with Santos to some extent continuing that policy, Colombia really positioned itself as very much against not only Venezuela's Bolivarian government, but more broadly sort of the left in the region. Of course, that relationship has become even more soured of late, since many Venezuelans have flocked to Colombia over the last year and a half as economic conditions have deteriorated there. And not only that, but I think importantly, it's worth mentioning that many opposition leaders, including a group that fashions itself the National Supreme Court in Exile, actually conducts its business in Colombia with the support of the Colombian government. And so there's sort of a parallel government that's housed in Colombia. And so all of this sort of suggests that Colombia really is positioning itself as very much against the Venezuelan government. On the other hand, you know, it's true that Venezuela and Maduro have consistently sort of blamed Colombia and Santos in particular for some of these interventionist moves, and then tying it to the United States and the close relationship between Colombia and the United States. My own sense is that, at least in this case, the very kind of amateurish features of the attack, even though there was sort of the high-tech drone component to it, really suggests that it's more of a rogue element that's taken advantage of the sort of wink and nod classic, yes, we will publicly condemn or even, you know, not say anything against, interventionist efforts, but we're not going to, we're not going to be sad if the Maduro government leaves, right? And so my sense is that that's the nature of the support right now, that it's sort of cover rather than any technical or material assistance. But yeah, that's certainly been the case in the past.
And the timing of this, Professor Gabriel Hetland, the timing of this attack on Nicolas Maduro, and do you think it's clear that it was an assassination attempt?
I think nothing's entirely clear at the moment, but it seems to be an attempted assassination against Maduro. And the timing of it is disturbing, mostly because Maduro has finally done some things that need to be done in Venezuela, accepted some responsibility for the economic crisis, which has really been devastating the country, and taken some actions, not entirely adequate, but some actions to actually move Venezuela in the right direction, specifically starting to discuss the much-needed currency reform, which Mark has written about widely for years and talked about, which is the #1 factor behind the economic crisis. And so about a week and a half ago, Maduro was making some changes. He was also sort of meeting with grassroots sectors, talking about moving Venezuela in a different direction. And all out of the blue, we get this drone attack, which could really sort of charge things up in Venezuela, move the country back to a crisis scenario, and make the possibility of economic reform and dialogue with the grassroots sort of Chavista sectors much more difficult. So it's a sort of tragic timing, and it may not be coincidental at all.
We're going to come back to this discussion in 30 seconds. Our guests are Gabriel Hetland of the University of Albany, the State University of New York at Albany, Alejandro Velasco, who is executive editor of NACLA and also a professor at New York University, and Mark Weisbrot, Center for Economic and Policy Research, joining us from D.C. Stay with us.
Ya no sopla el viento arriba, bajo de la cordillera, azorrazando en Santiago, calentando las trincheras. Canción de huesos chilenos, de lo profundo de adentro. Canción para los valientes, que la cante Víctor Jara, una canción de Violeta.
Ali Primera here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're talking about Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro survived an apparent assassination attempt on Saturday. But officials say 2 drones loaded with explosives detonated above Maduro as he gave a nationally televised speech at a military event in Caracas. Again, the first known attempted assassination by drone against a sitting head of state. Our guest, Alejandro Velasco, executive editor of NACLA, Report on the Americas. Also with us, Gabriel Hetland, associate professor of Latin American Studies at State University of New York and Albany, and Mark Weisbrot in Washington, D.C., of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Alejandro, can you talk about the popular sector and what's happening now in Venezuela and the response to what took place on Saturday?
Yeah. So the response actually has been pretty muted. On Sunday, Maduro called for a rally in solidarity and support, and it was not very well attended. He's called for another rally in support today on Monday, which, especially because it's a weekday, many government officials turn out for those rallies, so we expect more support to be shown there. But I think in terms of popular sectors and what they're going through, of course, is they're bearing the brunt of the economic crisis to which Gabe just alluded. Mostly daily life is a struggle to try to just get basic access to foods, to medicines, to cash, which is in short supply as hyperinflation is exploding. And so most of the day is really spent in the grind of trying to get by from one day to the next. That, of course, has led to a significant amount of discontent, some of which is expressed, for instance, again, as Gabe just mentioned, a recent very large peasants' march that saw hundreds of people, hundreds of peasants from the interior of the country where the economic conditions are most acutely felt, walking to Caracas to make demands upon the president. He met with them there. So there's a lot of discontent, certainly among popular sectors, but that's, of course, muted by the fact that there isn't really a credible opposition that they might latch onto as an alternative. So as far as popular sectors are concerned, they're really sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And to some extent, that that's expressed in the lack of of direct support that Maduro received on Sunday when he called for a rally.
Mark, I wanted to ask you about this opposition group, Frente Amplio, or Broad Front, issuing a statement accusing the Venezuelan government of leaping to the assumption the explosions were an assassination attempt and of making irresponsible accusations without any proof, saying, "We warn that the government is taking advantage of this incident to criminalize those who legitimately and democratically oppose it and deepen the repression and systematic human rights violations." And yet you have this group that, by Twitter, has taken responsibility for the attack. Mark Weisbrot.
Yes. Well, I mean, that was part of the media narrative. In fact, El País for a while had a headline up saying opposition accuses the government of staging the attack, and the other headlines calling it a supposed attack. And so you had that, and that El País usually leads a lot of the reporting in Latin America. El País is in Spain. And so you do have a lot of that out there and a lot of confusion over it. You know, again, I don't know any more details than what you see in the press.
Let me ask Gabe Hetland. You have this group, Operation Phoenix, claiming responsibility, a group of Venezuelan soldiers. Their former leader, Oscar Perez, killed in a shootout with the government in January after he hijacked a helicopter last year, firing at government buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the attack shows is sort of the crisis of the opposition. The opposition, by and large, boycotted the election in May. There's a lot we can criticize about the election, but there's a lot to criticize about the opposition and their lack of a sort of strategy for engaging with the economic crisis, for engaging with the popular sectors, which Alejandro was talking about. And so I think that this is an expression of the crisis of the opposition and their inability to come up with any sort of strategy. And the more the U.S. pressures the government of Venezuela, the more it opens up elements on the fringe to do things like this.
And finally, Mark Weisbrot, the Atlantic's Peter Beinart wrote, before becoming National Security Advisor, John Bolton declared, "We once had a capacity for clandestine efforts to overthrow governments. I wish we could get back. We could get those back." Do you think he's gotten those back, Mark?
Well, I don't think it ever left. I mean, I think they've been, you know, we know they've been involved. You know, it's part of our budget, the funding to USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy. They've stepped that up after the coup in 2002, and they've been continuing to pour millions of dollars in there. And so, yeah, I mean, and again, the real difference between the Trump administration and the previous administrations is now it's very explicit. They're trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela.
We have to leave it there, but I want to thank you all for being with us. Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Alejandro Velasco teaches at NYU and is executive editor of NACLA, Report on the Americas, and Gabriel Hetland of SUNY Albany State University of New York. As we end today's show on the 73rd anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, which killed 140,000 people, injured another 100,000. We end with the words of a Hiroshima survivor, Habakasha Koji Hosokawa. 17 years old when the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, his 13-year-old sister Yoko died in the bombing. He gave me a tour of Hiroshima when we were there a few years ago. He spoke to us near the A-bomb dome.
The A-bomb was dropped in Hiroshima and also one in Nagasaki. And I think the atomic bombs were dropped not just on our cities, but on the whole human beings. And so, I have many things to talk about my experience of the A-bomb. But if the next one, the third A-bomb, is to be dropped, then the Earth will be annihilated. I want people to understand this is going to be, you know, the Earth is going to be annihilated. So whenever I talk, I want them to understand this. The Peace Memorial Park, until the A-bomb, people lived here. Everything was destroyed. Everyone died around this area. The Peace Memorial Park is a beautiful park today with so many trees. Later they planted small trees, and after decades these trees became bigger, and now a very beautiful park today.
That's Koji Hosokawa speaking in front of the Peace Museum in Hiroshima. As he looked down at the ground, he said, "People lived here. People lived here." To see our whole interview with him when we were in Hiroshima, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.